In our first two reviews, I'm going to slide this down a little bit, we have chatted equations, so we talked opposites. We have talked inequalities, the graphs, what they look like, how to tell open closed dot, but it still was a lot like the equations, where if I know how to solve an equation, I'm going to be in good shape. So today, we're going to play with absolute value. I've got a couple things we'll add to the note sheet here as well, maybe with a couple more suggestions since we're getting closer now. But I want you to be aware when we're doing absolute value, there's going to be two answers every time. Okay? So we're going to create two equations so we can get two answers. You're like, but there's one equation there. How does this work? Here's how this works. My first equation that I'm going to solve, I just completely write down what I already got. K minus 8 equals 10. I just lose the absolute value bars. But when I go to make my second equation, everything stays the same except the sign of my answer. That's going to get flipped over to a negative. Once I've got that set, you solve the two equations just like we did in review number 1 with any equation, and you're done. You undo your minus 8. And get an answer. You undo your minus 8. Now this time, be careful. It's not just negative 18. I owe my friend 10 bucks. I pay him 8 back. And I'm done. So for any of the problems that you see in here, that's the route we're going to go. We're still going to just keep doing opposite. So let's say, let's roll down to number 6 here. Concept's the same. Rewrite exactly the same. Don't change a thing. Just lose the bars. Second one. Only thing that changes is the sign. Okie, thank you. And now we're back. Boxing in our variable term. We're adding 3 to it, so we're doing the opposite. And do not concern yourself if you end up with an answer that doesn't come out whole. I don't care if you go to a decimal, that's fine. Or, again, the math, but yes, sir. Well, I was just about to say, math, enter, enter, or you could have 14 over 5. Nice lead in. It's almost like we set that up on purpose. And the nice thing about the absolute value equations is, if you do your first one right, it's going to be the same 2 steps for the second one. Minus in the 3 again. Dividing by 5 again. And that one comes out nice anyway. So seriously, all absolute value is going to be to us is making sure there's 2 equations and that we're changing the sign of the answer. Not a bad thing. Not a bad thing. And so I keep peeking around, and I'm like, okay, what other craziness is going on here? Ooh. Okay. So I roll over to the back, and all of a sudden I see after number 11, and I'm like, okay, what's the difference that's changed here? Well, now I'm noticing there's starting to be stuff outside the absolute value. So I'm gonna kind of mark off this area a little bit, and I'm gonna make myself a note. We need to get the absolute value alone. Well, what we've got to concern ourselves with here is if I divide this into my two equations right away, I'm going to guarantee you one of them is going to be wrong. Okay? We don't want one of them to be wrong. So my first job with these is going to be I got to get the absolute value alone, then I can split it. So for instance, if we're doing number 11, okay, if my first job is to get that alone, how do I do that? What's my one step? How do I undo that? We're going to add the 2. Once that absolute value is alone, now I'm ready to do my two equations. Only when it's absolute value, though, do I have to concern myself with these things. And once I get here, what's going to be my opposite to solve both of these? It's the opposite of dividing by 8. Multiply. Okay, so does that mean that every time I do one of these, it's going to be a plus minus? No. No, it does not. Lots of things. So let's see here. Let's do another one of these. Let's do 12. 12's here, close and recent. So now, here's where I got to be careful on 12. Don't want to distribute. We're multiplying by negative 10. This isn't a plus 10 deal. We're multiplying by negative 10. So what's the opposite of multiplying by negative 10? Divide it. Okay. Otherwise known as, in English math, as, divide. All right. Okay. Once that absolute value is alone, now we're ready to do the split without the absolute value signs. Again, the only thing once that absolute value alone that's going to be different is one's going to be positive, one's going to be negative. Do my one opposite to get things situated. So the rest of this page is going to work that way. I get my absolute value alone, my one step, and then I go back and split it to 2. So as we get towards wrapping this one, I start to look and I'm like, oh crud. Solve the inequality and graph its solution. Okay, couple things to note here. Okay, one, we're going to want to see the inequality notes for what type of dots, where are arrows going, things like that. Here's the other part, though, and we'll end up, I'd suggest adding this to your note sheet when we get done. When you have an absolute value and the arrow is pointing toward it, it's going to be an AND statement. Okay, we talked about ands and ors and what the graphs looked like. If you have an absolute value and it's greater than, the arrow's eating the absolute value, that's going to be an OR statement. So what that does for me more than anything else is it gives me a clue of what the graph should look like. So how does this work? Okay, let's say we're looking at 16. The absolute value is greater than. So by knowing it's an OR, I know that my arrows should be going away from each other if I do this correctly. So how do I do it? Here's how we do it. We're still going to have two inequalities to solve. First one, copy what you see, just like we were doing with the equations. Second one, two things are going to change. The arrow flips and the sign changes. Those two things. I know. When these got run, instead of it pushing to the bottom of each, it pushed to the top instead, which is right. I hear you. And so once I've got that situated, same one step on each one. And I'm glad you mentioned that. If you couldn't hear that in the thing, I keep writing equals. We got to make sure with these that we keep the arrows, or it's going to be really hard to graph them. So here's why that and or thing is so important. When I go to graph now, and again, I still have all this here to help me. Okay, so at 7, am I going to have an open or a closed dot at 7? Closed because of the or equal to. And when my variable is greater than, it goes to the right. So, okay, that goes to the right. Then I look at my other one. At 3, I'm going to have another closed dot. And when the arrow is pointing at your variable, we go to the left because that's less than. It matches what it should look like, so I feel good that I've done it correctly. So that's something that we want to pay attention to. Now, let's play with another one. Let's play with the 18 right below it. So I look at 18 right below it. My absolute value, the arrow is pointing at it. So this is an AND statement. And typically with the ANDs, they're going to come together. It's like we have two endpoints and they crash together in the middle. So I go to split it into 2. Copy what you see on the first one. Second one, flip the arrow, change the sign. And I chose this one because there's one more twist. Doesn't happen a lot, but it does happen some. What's the opposite of multiplying by -8?
Dividend.
Yeah.
Dividend.
And when you divide by a negative to both sides, yeah, our arrow is going to flip. Only when this situation happens, though. Yet, whenever you divide both sides by a negative, the sign flips. If I don't do that, it's not going to work. Let me explain something here that hopefully will help that. This, again, is why it's so important that I want to know in advance what this should look like. So don't write what I'm going to here. Just kind of watch for a minute. Let's say I forgot to do the arrow flip. And so I divided and let's say I would have forgotten and I looked like this. If I would have gone to graph that, my arrow is pointing. Let me do one of these. Let's do this. My arrow is pointing at my variable, so that would go left. So I would have been on here, and I'd have gone to the left. And then I'd have come here and said, hey, my arrow's eating the x. We go to the right. And this is what my graph would have looked like. But there's a problem. That's not what an AND graph looks like. That's an OR graph. This is bad. That's not what we wanted. So by flipping those arrows and remembering, now when I graph, the arrow's eating it, that goes to the right. So at -1, we're going to the right. And here at 1, my arrow is going to the left. They crash in the middle like they're supposed to. Because by what I just showed here, if I don't, you get exactly the opposite of the answer that you're wanting. That's why the negatives cause that in here, where if I don't do the arrow with the sign, I'm going to get exactly the opposite of the answer that I'm looking for. Because I'm trying to figure out, let's see, can I figure out a different way of saying this? I might have to come and talk with you in a bit when we're doing some things, because yeah, I'm going to have to get creative on a third way to try and explain that. We'll figure it out. But I just don't want to kind of get us into lockdown here. But again, that's only if you divide both sides by a negative. It does not mean every time you see a negative, you flip. That'd be a lot of flipping, and it's a lot of flipping that we don't need to be doing. So that's something, once we get done with our last example or two, I might, again, make some suggestions on your note sheet on some things that would be a good thing to put there. This might be one of the problems that's good to do that with. I figure out and or based on, is the arrow pointing at the absolute value or is it eating it? That's completely it right here. or is eating it and is pointing at it. Every time. It is. So, okay. One last piece of the puzzle. So let's say, I'm going to go all the way to the end here. 27 I'm going to go up to. We just got done on the last page saying, make sure your absolute value is alone before you split. So here, if I add 2 to each side, now my absolute value is alone. Now I can split it into 2 equations. But there's lots of info here for me to make sure everything looks good and works right. I'm not going to do that yet. So again, every absolute value, flip the arrow, change the sign on your second one. Got to get that first step done, though. And now work on getting x alone. Bless you. And yes, sometimes you are going to get a fraction or decimal. No worries. Just make sure your variable and your x don't get messed up, and we'll be good. As long as I take my time and get the first one right, the second one should be easy because I'm following the same 2 steps. We're going to minus 5 from both sides. We're going to divide by 4. Yep, got to keep it as arrows. And so the one last thing we didn't mention at the start, we move this up a little. When the arrow is pointing here, we mentioned that this was an and statement when the arrow is pointing at the absolute value. And is the ones that come together. So let's see if we did this right. 5.5 between 5 and 6 here. It is an or equal to, so we'll have a closed in dot. And follow the arrow, in this case. Less than goes left. I come over to here. I'm at -8, again, filled in circle. That's the line underneath. X is greater than, which means we're going to be going to the right. But as we said when we did this originally, we know what this is supposed to look like, so color in the middle. So let me know that you know that's what we're supposed to do. So, again, just because I mentioned something that I think would work for me when I'm talking about the notes doesn't mean you have to do that. But in knowing what the final looks like, I'm kind of getting some things that I've seen people possibly miss before. So let me make a couple of suggestions for your final notes as far as absolute value goes. So let me pop this up a little bit. So I'd always say, I'm going to try and write kind of small to make sure there's always going to be two equations or inequalities. I always want to make sure that I flip the sign of the answer or arrow on the second equation or inequality. And then again, everything else, I'm just going to look at the inequalities section to get help. So for me, when I'm trying to figure out, okay, what else might I want to add from things that Hardy has mentioned, I might even do that, and I've already got the and or up above, so I could get that. And then I'm just going to put in 2 or 3 examples. I'm not going to go crazy here and try and put 6 or 7 in like I did the equations. To me, if I could get 3 examples in here, might even extend this a little bit and see if I could maybe get a 4th, okay? I would take 2 or 3 right off of here. I'd do an equation. So maybe even something as straightforward as number 1, just to get an idea. I'd do maybe an equation where you've got to get it alone first. That'd be a second. Do a basic inequality with a graph for the third. And then do one where I got to get it alone first for a 4th. And that way I got 1, 2, 3, 4 spaces here to do those 4 things. And yes, before we get to the final, I don't know if it'll be Friday or Monday, I'm probably at that point going to say, here's what my sheet would look like. And then you can decide if you want to make a different one of your own or if you just want to roll with what I do. So either of those would be fine, but none of that stuff does you any good if you don't practice to make it stick in your head. Because if you don't practice, I could give you the exam notes and you could go into the final. It's going to do you no good because you're not going to know what to do with them. So practice. Answers are up front. Answers are online. And if you need to go back later, check a video on something. That'd be cool too. But if you do those, we got 2 reviews left to go. And then we can get into specifics. So